Hey guys, tonight we step back into a world without screens, where the heartbeat of America thumped softly through a wooden box in the corner of your living room. It's the 1930s, and while the streets outside may be lined with breadlines and dust, inside, voices glow from the radio like distant stars. You don't have much, maybe your shoes are patched, and the coffee's mostly chicory. But when that dial hums to life, suddenly, the world opens wide. You're just a kid, maybe 10 or 11, and the nights stretch long and quiet. Television hasn't been invented yet, or at least not in any way you can see or afford. But your neighbor, Mr. Halberd, 2 doors down, has a radio. A big one, mahogany, with golden mesh over the speakers and knobs that click like safe tumblers. You only ever glimpse it from his open window in summer, but the sound drifts out like honey. Music, stories, strange voices, news from a president you've never seen but somehow trust. You probably won't survive this era without a bit of dirt under your nails and a sense of imagination that can fill in the missing pictures. But you've got both. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far this little radio show travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start hearing the hum first, low and warm, like the sound of your mother's stove coming to life. Then a faint crackle, like summer rain on a tin roof. Your neighbor's radio is always set just a little too loud, but no one minds. In fact, on sweltering evenings when the windows are all thrown open and the ice has melted in everyone's water glasses, it becomes a sort of communal blessing. You lean against the windowsill, elbows resting in the chipped paint, and let the words drift in. It's not music tonight. It's a story. A man with a voice smoother than molasses is talking about an old mine out west, and how he was almost tricked by an outlaw who wore 2 left boots. You don't know if the story's true, but that's not really the point. In this world, sound is reality. Back then, people talked about radio like a ghost. How it entered your home through the air, how it brought voices from thousands of miles away into your very living room. It wasn't just novelty, it was witchcraft that paid for itself in comfort. The way some folks today might crave Wi-Fi, you and your family craved clear reception. If you were lucky, you had your own set, a Philco or Zenith, maybe, proudly perched on a doily-covered end table. If not, well, maybe the corner store had one playing as you loitered under the awning, pretending to shop while listening to last night's baseball game. The radio became the nation's fireplace, not just a source of light or warmth, but a gathering place for stories. It also democratized storytelling in a strange way. Before, tales were passed around dinner tables or church pews. But now, you and a steelworker in Pittsburgh and a widow in rural Montana could all laugh at the same joke told by a man named Jack Benny at the same time. In a country divided by class and geography, that mattered. Mainstream historians often point to 1930s radio as the beginning of mass culture. But fringe scholars whisper something more mystical, that it was our first shared dream. You remember your first real encounter with the radio like a crush. It was the Lone Ranger, and you didn't know voices could gallop until that night. The hoofbeats were made from coconut shells clapped together in a sound studio 1,000 miles away, but to you, they thundered through your very soul. Even commercials, yes, even those were somehow charming. You can still recite that toothpaste jingle that promised sparkling teeth and the admiration of the opposite sex, which you didn't yet understand but found intriguing. The funny thing is, most of these early programs had no visuals, and yet you saw them more clearly than any TV show today. Your mind painted every detail. The dusty trail, the villain's crooked smile, the glint of a deputy's badge at sundown. You'd compare notes with your friends the next day, only to find out everyone had imagined it slightly differently. Historians still argue whether this golden radio era was America's first real, national imagination. Before then, people imagined alone. Now, millions imagined together but privately in their own heads. You'd wait all day for your favorite show, sprint through homework, inhale dinner, and sit cross-legged on the rug, eyes wide, ears sharper than they'd ever be again in your life. And when the show ended, that final musical flourish fading into the dark, something would settle over the room. Stillness, reflection, a kind of cultural exhale. You didn't know it then, but you were living in a golden age. And it all began with that one neighbor's window, left just slightly ajar. The first time you see a radio being made, it looks nothing like the glowing wood-paneled boxes you're used to. No polished curves or Art Deco flourishes. Just a skeleton of tubes, wires, and what looks like someone's attempt at making a cake out of scrap metal. You're in a garage with your uncle, who's explaining vacuum tubes like he's unwrapping sacred relics. These, he says, are what make the voice come alive. You nod solemnly, not quite getting it, but deeply impressed. Later, you'll learn that the invention of the vacuum tube is what made modern broadcasting possible. Those fragile little bulbs that hummed and pulsed with invisible power. Before that, radio was just Morse code and static. Afterward, it became your grandmother crying quietly to FDR's fireside chats. It's the 1930s, and America is in the thick of it. Jobs are gone, banks have collapsed, and people are trading apples on street corners like they're gold. But still, radios are selling. Somehow, even with no meat on the dinner table, families scrape together enough for a second-hand set. Why? Because in a world crumbling around them, they need something to hold them together. You remember your cousin in Kansas, who didn't have a radio, sending letters begging for transcripts of shows. Entire scripts were passed around like underground literature. People would read them aloud, trying to mimic the voices. And then there were the radio clubs. Kids huddling in attics or barns, reperforming skits with made-up sound effects, banging on pots or dragging chains for thunder. One fringe detail that most history books ignore: the rise of phantom stations, pirate broadcasters who used fake call letters to transmit strange tales, hoaxes, or political manifestos. Most were harmless, some not so much, and to this day, historians still argue whether one infamous ghost station out of Ohio actually predicted World War II, or just got lucky. But the real power of radio wasn't in conspiracy, it was in community. You see, radio didn't just tell you what was happening. It reminded you that you weren't alone, that someone somewhere was going through the same thing. Boiling dandelion greens for dinner, listening for job rumors, or praying the rains would come this year. And then there were the voices, so many voices. Some of them became like family. Fibber McGee and Molly, Amos and Andy Orson Welles. You'd know their voices anywhere, like the smell of your mother's soup or the feel of your old quilt. They carried you through the nights. Of course, not everything was rosy. Radio also carried propaganda, subtle and not so subtle. There were shows funded by soap companies that portrayed certain immigrant characters as lazy or silly. It's uncomfortable now, but it's part of that strange American cocktail. Hope mixed with prejudice, laughter layered over ignorance. Your grandfather, a stoic man who never hugged you, would sit transfixed during political commentaries. He'd grunt approval or snort disdain at the talking heads. Though back then, they weren't heads, just voices. And you'd watch him, learning how men form opinions, how silence says more than words. Sometimes the power went out mid-broadcast, and your heart would plummet. The room would fall into such a sudden quiet. It felt like the whole world had slipped off its axis. But when the juice came back and the voices resumed, as if they hadn't even noticed, they became more magical than ever. One of your favorite programs was The Shadow. That line, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men," gave you delicious chills. But what really stuck was the echo effect they used for the Shadow's voice. A simple trick, but it turned a regular guy into something immortal. That's how radio worked. Small tricks, big emotions. You recall a moment clear as daylight when your father cried during a broadcast. It was during a fireside chat. Roosevelt was talking about fear itself, and though you didn't get all the words, the weight of them dropped like a stone in the room. Your father wiped his face quickly, thinking no one saw. You said nothing, and neither did your mother. That silence was reverence. Historians often debate whether FDR's mastery of radio saved the nation from deeper despair. Fringe thinkers say his voice was trained like an actor's, almost hypnotic. Maybe both are true. Either way, it worked. And yet, for all its national reach, radio still felt personal. There was always the illusion that they were talking just to you. Maybe it was the static that made you lean in, or the way voices felt warmer than film. Whatever it was, it made a hard world feel just a bit softer. You close your eyes that night, the last strains of a comedy show still fading. The laughter lingers in your chest. And though your stomach might not be full, your heart is. You're up before the sun, and the house is still draped in hush. The only sound is the quiet pop of the stove as someone in the next room coaxes a flame to life. But soon, the silence will give way to your favorite morning ritual. The hum, click, and crackle of the radio warming up. It's a gentle kind of magic, like waking a sleeping friend. And you wait for it, not because of what it will say, but because of how it makes the house feel less lonely. Morning radio in the 1930s and 40s isn't high drama or politics. It's cheerful orchestras, homemaking tips, weather forecasts in that strange sing-song cadence, and of course, your mother's favorite, the Housewives' Protective League. You used to think that was some kind of superhero club for ladies with aprons and rolling pins. And honestly, you weren't too far off. Those early broadcasts are aimed squarely at the domestic heart of America. Mothers, widows, daughters trying to keep a home going on nothing but coffee grounds and flour sacks. They lean in close to catch new recipes, household hacks. And here's the twist: subtle advertisements from sponsors. It's not just a show. It's the birth of the commercial lifestyle. Radio doesn't just tell you what's happening. It tells you what you're missing, and how a new box of soap flakes might solve your existential dread. You're too young to care about detergent, but you notice your mother's face soften whenever a certain host comes on. She doesn't laugh often these days, but the woman on the radio, bright, chipper, always polite, draws a smile, even a chuckle. It's like the room gets warmer. And then comes the music. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Count Basie, they're the rock stars of your time. Their swing and jazz rhythms float through the walls, turning your kitchen into a dance floor. You remember your sister dancing barefoot on the linoleum, trying to copy the jitterbug she heard described on a show last week. No one in your house has ever taken a formal lesson, but you all move like you've been practicing for years. Poverty teaches rhythm in strange ways. There's a quiet detail no one mentions in the textbooks. How local announcers in small towns often doubled as marriage counselors, funeral readers, or weather prophets. They'd say, "Our prayers go out to the family on Miller Street," and everyone would know who they meant. In that sense, radio wasn't mass media. It was community bulletin, therapist's couch, and town square, all rolled into one. Of course, not all the voices were comforting. You remember, even as a kid, the clipped tones of news bulletins. They made the house colder. Words like Germany, invasion, shortage, and rationing would change the atmosphere instantly. Your mother would lower the flame on the stove, your father would stop whittling, and your siblings would look to the door like something might walk through it. Still, between the grim headlines, there were moments of charm. Breakfast with the Bickersons, full of comedic bickering and domestic absurdity. Or Arthur Godfrey Time, where jokes came with ukuleles and unscripted laughs. Historians still argue whether those programs dumbed America down or held it together. Fringe scholars insist that comedy radio was a low-key therapy session for a shell-shocked nation. You, meanwhile, just liked how it made your brother snort milk through his nose. Some mornings, the signal didn't come in clearly, especially when the sky was moody. You'd hear a kind of ghost version of the show, warped voices drifting in and out like spirits telling bad jokes. And you'd wait, wrapped in a blanket, half hoping it would fix itself, half enjoying the haunted echo of it all. You think back to your neighbor, old Mrs. Tilden, who didn't have a radio. She'd come over with excuses, a borrowed teaspoon, an empty cup, and then quietly settle into the corner chair, eyes closed, drinking in the broadcast like it was warm soup. No one mentioned it. It just became part of the rhythm. You learned young that radio didn't need visuals to be vivid. Your imagination did the heavy lifting. When a host described the sunrise over New York Harbor, you saw it right down to the gulls circling, the steam rising from the ships. You didn't need a picture. You just needed a voice. And that voice became your anchor. One winter, a particularly brutal one, you remember lying in bed, layered in every piece of clothing you owned. The power had flickered, but your father rigged a battery to the radio. And as the snow piled outside and the wind howled like a wild dog, a warm baritone voice read poetry. Yes, poetry, on some late-night show. You can't recall the name of the host, but you'll never forget the line. And still we rise, even if the floorboards groan beneath us. That line stayed with you. Radio, in its way, wasn't just entertainment, it was resistance. Against despair, against loneliness, against the idea that you were forgotten. So even as the world outside sputtered and changed, even as planes roared overhead and soldiers marched off to war, your morning still began the same way. With a knob, a hum, a voice, and the certainty that someone, somewhere, was speaking just to you. The clock ticks toward evening, and dinner simmers on the stove, just enough for everyone, though never quite enough to leave anyone full. But you don't mind, because after the dishes are dried and the last crumbs swept from the table, something special happens. The living room becomes a theater. The radio, that boxy little magician in the corner, flickers to life. It's prime time now. Welcome to the golden hours. You curl up next to your sister, a patchwork quilt pulled over both of you. Your father shifts in his armchair, pipe in hand, while your mother knits something indistinct but rhythmic. This is your routine, and tonight's headliner, The Shadow. That rich, velvety voice begins. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. And you shiver every time, even though you've heard it dozens of times, maybe hundreds. That opening line is more than a catchphrase. It's a portal. It tells you that for the next 30 minutes, you'll escape into alleys with mysterious vigilantes, slip behind the masks of ordinary men, and come back just before bedtime. It's not real, of course, but your heart doesn't know that, and neither does your imagination. Primetime radio is where the country exhaled. The dramas, the mysteries, the comedies, they didn't just entertain. They soothed. They filled the rooms of homes that had lost too much and reminded their occupants that not everything was broken. Some things still worked, like timing, punchlines, and plot twists. You remember Fibber McGee and Molly, where McGee's overstuffed closet was more famous than most politicians. Every episode, he'd open it, and a barrage of clattering junk would tumble out. A joke so predictable it somehow never stopped being funny. Historians still argue whether such simple humor helped unify a fractured population or merely distracted them from bigger issues. Meanwhile, you were busy laughing until you snorted. Then there was Lights Out, which aired late and scared you halfway to death. They said not to listen alone, but you did anyway. It was like leaning into a nightmare just to feel alive. The show once featured a man turning into a chicken, feather by feather. Another involved people melting, literal melting, and somehow it made you giddy, terrified, sure, but alive. Those shows were your gateway into a world far bigger than your town. Through radio, you toured haunted mansions, rode rocket ships, wandered ancient Egypt, solved murders, and on occasion learned a lesson or two. Not every episode ended happily, but they always ended neatly. And in a world where real problems felt big and unfixable, that kind of neatness was medicine. And the sponsors, of course. You couldn't forget them if you tried. Every few minutes, your adventure was interrupted by jingles and slogans. Blue coal, the safe coal, or try a panna for the smile of beauty. You didn't even know what a panna was, but by the age of 9, you could sing its theme song better than your own birthday tune. Those ads were more than commercials. They were stitched into the very structure of radio. You learned, without meaning to, that the world was always selling something. That comfort came with a catch. That stories, even the scariest or silliest, had sponsors. But it didn't ruin the magic. You remember once when the power went out mid-show, and your father kept the story going himself. He mimicked the voices, filled in the gaps, even added extra jokes. For half an hour, he became the radio. And you realized something: the magic wasn't in the machine. It was in the way it gave your family an excuse to gather, to imagine, to share something invisible and unforgettable. And those programs? They were appointment events. The whole country tuned in at once. Imagine that: millions of ears turned toward the same story, the same joke, the same heartbeat. The president himself used that same airspace for his fireside chats, where he made people believe that even the government could speak in a voice that calmed rather than commanded. Roosevelt didn't just give speeches, he gave assurance. That's a big word, but you felt it. Sitting on the floor with scraped knees and soup breath. Not everything on the radio aged well. Some skits were cruel, some comedy tinged with prejudice. Historians still argue whether those portrayals reflected the times or reinforced them. You remember your mother hushing the room during certain characters, her face a little too still. You didn't understand it then, but the memory stuck. Still, you treasure the feeling of being included in something bigger. Even if you didn't know the actors' faces, you knew their voices like old friends. The Lone Ranger wasn't just a masked cowboy, he was your masked cowboy. Amos and Andy were your nightly company. Even if their laughs came with an uncomfortable undertone, you took what joy you could, even if you didn't fully understand the cost. And at the end of each show, the sign-offs were like lullabies. "Good night and pleasant dreams," they'd say. Or, "We'll see you again next time." Same time, same station. Those phrases hung in the air long after the broadcast ended. They wrapped around your heart like a soft promise. That the stories would continue. That the voice would return. That tomorrow would come. In a house with thin walls and thinner wallets, the radio was your richest possession. It didn't weigh anything, didn't need much to run, and yet it delivered the whole world into your lap. And in those primetime hours, you didn't feel poor. You felt connected, cradled, and somehow, against all odds, hopeful. As the last laugh line echoes and your mother clicks off the radio with a gentle snap, the room falls quiet. Not empty, never that, but resting. The kind of quiet that only follows something complete, like the moment right after a song ends or when the final puzzle piece slides into place. It's in the stillness that another kind of magic happens. Radio news. You're too young to love it, but old enough to listen. The announcer's voice drops a register, smooth and starchy like a linen suit. He talks about places you've only ever heard of through static. Berlin, Tokyo, Moscow. And names: Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain. Names that carry tension like storm clouds rolling in. You don't understand geopolitics, but you know when your father stops chewing mid-bite to listen harder. Something matters. And right there, beside the worn rug and flickering oil lamp, you realize radio isn't just a toy, it's a lifeline, your connection to the larger, louder world. The one spinning beyond your picket fence and parched cornfield. The radio news is brisk, clipped, full of strange numbers and neutral tones. It tells you how many jobs were lost, how many troops were moved, and how many banks failed this week, delivered with the emotional depth of a weather forecast. Still, your family listens like it's scripture, because beneath all the numbers and names, it's decoding something sacred, the shape of tomorrow. You catch little things. The unemployment rate dropped by 0.5 point. 0.5 point doesn't sound like much, but your dad quietly nods like someone just handed him a small piece of good news wrapped in a bigger pile of nothing. And then come the oddities. Did you know that in 1938, Orson Welles nearly gave the entire country a heart attack by reading War of the Worlds like it was an actual alien invasion? People panicked, packed suitcases, even fled towns. Historians still argue whether it was media manipulation or mass hysteria, or perhaps a nation so starved for clarity that even fiction felt factual. Your dad laughed about it for days. "Imagine being scared by a Martian with a New Jersey accent," he said, though he turned down the volume a notch after that night, just in case. Then there are the personal moments. Radio contest winners being announced live, families reuniting over special broadcasts, even local heroes getting shout-outs. Your town isn't on the airwaves. Too small, too quiet. But when someone from 3 counties over wins a new icebox or talks about the size of their prize hog, it somehow feels like your win too. And oh, the wartime broadcast. As the 30s draw to a tense close, the station changes. More military marches. More gravitas. You hear names of foreign leaders with icy vowels. The tone tightens. Your mom folds her hands a little harder during those segments, like she's bracing for something unspoken. And in those years, the president becomes more than just a name.
Franklin D.
Roosevelt is the voice. His fireside chats aren't just speeches, they're events. You remember sitting cross-legged, your head tilted toward the radio, as FDR explained the New Deal like he was talking directly to you, like somehow the leader of the free world knew you had questions. No country, however rich, can afford the waste of its human resources, he says, and it feels like permission to matter, even when your coat has holes and your pantry echoes. Your parents trust him in a way they've never trusted anyone in Washington. He doesn't yell. He doesn't condescend. He soothes. And somehow that's more powerful than any bill passed in Congress. That's the power of the microphone. And back then, the radio was king of microphones. It even touched romance. More than once, you caught your older cousin penning letters to Gene Autry, the singing cowboy, swearing he sang just for her. He never replied, of course, but she wore her heart on her sleeve, and a dime store cowboy hat to dinner. And when news of Lindbergh's baby kidnapping broke in 1932, you remember the silence that followed. The nation held its breath through every update, every false lead. Historians still debate whether the radio helped or hurt that investigation, whether the constant updates spread hope or hysteria. All you remember is how your mother held your hand tighter that night. Even ads changed their tune during these years. Soap operas, those long, emotional dramas about tangled love and teary betrayals, were literally sponsored by soap companies. Hence the name. Women across the country timed chores around them. And maybe that sounds silly now, but back then, a good cliffhanger was better than coffee. The radio dictated rhythms. Meals were served between shows. Letters written during news breaks. You even timed bathroom runs so you wouldn't miss your favorite commercial jingle. It sounds funny, but remember, this was before DVR, before pause buttons. If you missed it, it was gone. And those newsmen, they weren't flashy. No dramatic inflections or flashy graphics. Just steady voices, clear enunciation, and a trust that the facts, when delivered properly, would land with weight. No need for shouting. Truth back then had its own gravity. But the stories that lingered most were local call-ins. Farmers talking about the dust choking their wheat. Mothers calling for milk donations. Even kids asking Santa what it's like to fly at night. You clung to those moments. They were yours. Evenings like that didn't just inform you, they shaped you. They made the world feel near enough to touch, yet big enough to respect. They taught you to listen, to wait, to imagine. And most of all, they taught you that even in the darkest stretches of uncertainty, a voice in the dark can make all the difference. So when the announcer signs off with, "Good night, America," wherever you are, it doesn't sound corny. It sounds true, because that's exactly where you are. Out there, in the soft glow of radio light, wrapped in a story, waiting for tomorrow. The summer air hangs heavy as you step outside with your father. The screen door creaking shut behind you. Crickets chirp, lightning bugs blink their silent Morse code, and a faint breeze carries the low hum of someone else's radio drifting through the trees. You follow the gravel path toward the general store, not because you need anything in particular, but because this is what people do after supper. You walk, you talk, you listen. Inside, the store is dim and warm, and it smells like licorice, dust, and motor oil. Behind the counter, a squat radio buzzes beside the register, its tuning slightly off. Someone fiddles with the knob until the station sharpens. It's Jack Benny again, cracking wise about his violin. Laughter ripples through the store. Not belly laughter. That tired, grateful kind that comes from folks who haven't smiled all day. Here, the radio isn't background noise. It's the heartbeat of the room. You wander past sacks of flour, jars of penny candy, and a shelf of soap that smells vaguely like a pine forest. In the corner, a few older men sit around a checkerboard, trading quiet moves and louder opinions. They're talking about the Yankees. Or was it the price of eggs? Or both? The lines blur. But between jokes and groans, the radio plays on, narrating a world much bigger than this tiny hub. And then comes the twist, the live radio remote. You've never seen one before. The station out of Tulsa has sent a man, slick hair, sharp suit, silver microphone, to broadcast from the store. His voice rises above the usual static. We're here with the good folks of Okima, Oklahoma, where the coffee's hot and the gossip hotter. He holds out the mic to the checker players. One of them blinks. Well, I don't much care for gossip, he says deadpan. The room erupts in laughter. The broadcast crackles on. These were the golden days of radio remotes. Small-town broadcasts that weren't about headlines or war, but about tomatoes and missing cats and Betty Lou's new baby. The voice of your town made public. Sometimes, it even reached the next town over. Historians still argue whether these micro-broadcasts played any role in shaping rural solidarity during the Depression. The announcer might say if he weren't too busy interviewing your uncle about his goat. And you just stand there, pretending to look at the gum rack, secretly hoping someone asks you to speak into the mic. They don't, but you buy 2 pieces of double mint anyway. Later that week, you visit your aunt's house, and guess what she has? Cathedral-style Philco radio. Glossy walnut wood, knobs as smooth as river stones. It looks like furniture. It is furniture, positioned like an altar in the living room. And just like church, everyone sits in respectful silence when it plays. But this one has shortwave. Your cousin shows you how to twist the dial and pull in stations from Cuba, Canada, and one magical night, Berlin. The voices are strange, sharp, urgent. You catch a string of German you can't decipher. Your cousin looks nervous and switches it back to a music station. You don't talk about it. Not all sounds were meant for children. Later that night, as shadows stretch across the linoleum, you lie on the guest bed and listen to a swing band from Chicago. The saxophones melt into the dark like honey on toast. And right then, you realize something. This is what connection feels like. Not just to the station, to people. Somewhere out there, other kids are listening to this exact note at the exact same second. You're together even if you never meet. Radio fandom is real, by the way. Just ask anyone who's ever stood in line for a signed photo of a voice. You might not know their face, but you'd recognize that nasal drawl anywhere. There's even gossip. Rumors swirl that one announcer drinks too much, that another dyes his hair. Your teacher insists the NBC chime is actually Morse code. It's not. Your neighbor swears up and down that radio waves make chickens lay more eggs. No one knows. And that's where the fun lies. Not just in what's on the radio, but what's around it. The stories, the superstitions, the personal mythologies that bloom like dandelions in the static. One time, your school held a radio day. Everyone brought in their favorite show jingle. Some sang, some whistled. You recited the entire intro to the Lone Ranger, complete with galloping sound effects. Your classmates clapped, but one kid said it wrong. It's hi-yo, silver, not hi-ho. You corrected him like your life depended on it. And let's not forget the sponsors. Ovaltine, Wheaties, Lucky Strike. Their jingles wormed their way into your brain. Breakfast of champions, they'd say, and even though you hadn't won anything, you figured a spoonful might help. It didn't. Some ads were more creative than others. There was a toothpaste company that wrote a murder mystery ad campaign. You had to buy the next week's toothpaste to get the next clue. That's commitment. Historians still argue whether that was genius marketing or a public health crisis in disguise. You remember evenings where your family would shout at the radio like it was a relative. That's not how you pronounce Nevada. Or you tell him Walter, and then just like that, silence. Because a song came on. A slow, melancholy tune, sung by someone whose voice seemed soaked in tears and whiskey. The kind of song that made you stop and hold your breath. You didn't know pain could sound that beautiful. In those moments, the radio wasn't a box. It was a mirror, prayer, a long-distance friend. And whether it came from Tulsa or Timbuktu, you were grateful for every note. You walk home that night under a bowl of stars. The air is cooler now, quieter, but in your head, the echoes linger. The laughter, the jingles, the sweet croon of someone who'll never know your name, but sang like they did. The next morning, you're barely awake before the radio's already humming in the kitchen. Your mom has it tuned to the morning homemaker's show, the kind that opens with cheerful xylophone music and a voice so perky you're convinced she's never had a bad day in her life. She's giving advice on how to make meatloaf stretch through Thursday, and your mom, half listening while cracking eggs, hums in agreement. Use oatmeal instead of breadcrumbs, the voice says. You try to imagine oatmeal in meatloaf and immediately regret it. But it's not really about the recipes, is it? That sunny voice on the radio is like a companion. Someone who shows up rain or shine, a little too chipper maybe, but reliably there. In a time when so many women were stuck at home, scrubbing, sewing, raising kids, the homemaker's broadcast was more than entertainment. It was connection, a reminder that someone else out there understood the slog of dirty aprons and tight budgets. And the products, oh the products. You'd think these women were running chemistry labs. Every show had its sponsor. Bleach, laundry soap, perfume that promised to keep your husband coming home for dinner. That was a real line. Historians still argue whether those slogans were brilliant psychology or just a sign of how weirdly gendered the 1930s could get. Meanwhile, in the living room, your dad's trying to catch the weather report. He squints at the sky like it personally betrayed him and mutters something about barometric pressure. The announcer is listing temperatures like they're lottery numbers, and you're not sure what it all means, but you nod sagely anyway. Then comes the farm report. This is when the entire mood of the household shifts. You could play jazz, news, even soap operas with half an ear, but the farm report demands full attention. It's the heartbeat of rural America. Corn prices, hog futures, rainfall in Iowa. This is what determines whether folks eat well this month or scrape by on canned peaches and hope. You listen to terms like yield per acre and topsoil degradation, trying to sound knowledgeable, but all you really care about is whether the strawberries will be ripe in time for the county fair. Still, you sense the gravity, the unspoken understanding that one bad frost or another week without rain could send everything sideways. Funny how a disembodied voice from 3 states away could shape the way your family planned the week. What day to plant, when to mend the fence, whether to gamble on another crate of seed. The radio turned into a kind of oracle, imperfect, crackly, but still sacred. And then comes the joke segment. Every show has one. A 5-minute detour into puns, one-liners, and that weirdly common joke about the traveling salesman and a talking mule. You don't really get it, but your uncle laughs so hard he wheezes, so it must be funny. Sometimes the radio would host contests, jingle competitions, story submissions. You remember mailing in your version of a breakfast cereal poem. It began boldly, with "Oh golden flakes of morning joy," and ended in shame when your little brother drew a mustache on it and mailed it off without your permission. You never heard back. No one admits it, but the radio became a kind of training ground for dreams. You'd hear an actor read a dramatic script and imagine yourself on stage. You'd listen to a jazz singer and try to imitate her voice in the barn. You'd hear the news announcer's crisp, commanding tone and think, maybe I could do that too. Your teacher once said that radio expanded children's vocabulary by 14%. That number may or may not be made up, but it sure sounded impressive at the PTA meeting. Historians still argue whether radio had measurable cognitive benefits or just taught kids to mimic gangster slang. Either way, your friends started saying things like swell, dame, and see here, copper, like they were born in Chicago. But for every educational moment, there was equal weirdness. One guy claimed the radio taught his cow to dance. Another swore he could hear ghosts between stations. You're not sure if he was kidding. And then there were the mystery shows. Oh, the thrill of those. Creeping violins. Footsteps echoing down hallways. A scream in the dark. You'd sit huddled with your cousins under a blanket, trying not to flinch when the killer's voice rasped through the speaker. I know where you are. Your aunt would roll her eyes and call it nonsense. But she never left the room until the story ended. There was one mystery show where the twist was that the detective had been dead the whole time. You gasped, out loud. It stuck with you for days. The idea that someone could still solve things, even from the other side. That's the thing about Golden Age radio. It made the world bigger, stranger, more deliciously eerie. It made you question things. Not just who stole the necklace, but whether the world was as small as it sometimes felt. And sometimes, in the middle of a broadcast, the station would go silent for a beat too long. Dead air, a technical glitch, or maybe a pause for effect. But in that moment, your heart would catch, just a little. You'd remember that everything you were hearing came from wires and waves and faith. That voice you trusted? It was riding invisible currents, dodging trees and thunderstorms, just to reach you. When it came back, "Sorry, folks, we had a bit of a hiccup there," you'd sigh in relief. The world was still turning. The story could go on. You never realized how intimate that relationship was. A machine, sure, but also a companion, a performer, a friend. And whether it told you how to bake a tuna casserole or how to identify a werewolf by his laugh, it became part of you. Just like your mom's oatmeal meatloaf, which somehow doesn't taste as bad as it sounds. You've barely digested the oatmeal meatloaf before the living room transforms once again. The radio, ever loyal and always a little dusty, crackles to life with the slow swell of a string orchestra. You recognize it instantly. It's the opening to one of those big, sweeping drama serials. The Edge of Night, or maybe Our Gal Sunday. It's hard to keep them straight. All you know is that someone's always fainting, scheming, or being mysteriously replaced by a twin they didn't know they had. Soap operas. Not the fancy, TV-glossed ones you'd find years later, but raw, acoustic sagas full of gasps and sighs and improbable love triangles. Your grandmother never misses them. She sits by the window, darning socks with a look of such grim concentration you'd think she was decoding enemy transmissions. But no, it's just Evelyn discovering that her fiancé is actually her long-lost cousin. Again, historians still argue whether these shows genuinely reflected women's lives, or just fed them escapist fantasies soaked in melodrama. One thing's certain, women tuned in by the millions. And not just women. More than one truck driver or farmhand claimed he just happened to catch an episode now and then. The line between guilty pleasure and genuine addiction? Let's just say it was blurred by 1930s static. The term soap opera itself? A wink to the sponsors, detergent companies who practically owned the time slots. They knew exactly who was listening during those midday hours. The women running the household. And nothing sells soap like a juicy betrayal set to a violin crescendo. You sit cross-legged, picking at a scab and trying to follow the plot. There's something about a baby switch and a stolen fortune. The acting is so dramatic you'd swear someone's actually crying into the microphone. You picture the scene. An actress in pearls, holding her script in one hand and clutching her heart with the other. The sound effects crew dropping a stack of books to simulate someone collapsing. It's all so extra, and somehow exactly what everyone needs. Outside, the wind picks up. You glance toward the fields. Dust curls up at the edge of the sky. It's been doing that more lately. Less rain, more whispers of the word drought. But inside, the air stays calm. Inside, Evelyn is still deciding whether to marry Gregory or confront her identical twin about that whole affair with the gardener. It's funny what drama gives people. A way to feel big emotions without having to break anything. To cry about someone else's problems when your own feel too heavy to name. One time, your aunt wept for an entire afternoon because Margaret's baby didn't make it through the storm. You didn't even know who Margaret was. Just a voice, really. But it mattered. The shows weren't always nonsense, either. Every once in a while, they'd sneak in a little social message. A character would talk about equal pay or the cost of war bonds. Sometimes they'd break the fourth wall and remind you to write your senator. Other times, the moral lesson was less subtle. Like when Helen got hit by a streetcar for lying to her boss. You remember one particular episode where the entire week's plot centered around a radio going missing. The day the voice went silent. It was oddly meta. And yes, the whole town unraveled in panic because they couldn't listen to their usual program. People fought. Secrets were spilled. Turns out the radio was never stolen, just unplugged by a jealous cat. Your grandfather said it was the best piece of drama he'd heard in years. When the soap operas ended for the day, the mood always shifted. A brief silence, like the house was catching its breath. Your mom would sigh, your grandmother would clack her needles faster, and you'd feel a small pang, like saying goodbye to people you didn't really know but secretly rooted for. That's the thing about voices in the dark, they become friends of a sort. Their lives more glamorous, more tragic, more ridiculous than yours. But sometimes, in a weird way, they mirrored the ache in your chest you didn't know how to name. Then the radio would spin its dial again. A quick commercial, something about cough drops or foot powder, and boom, time for the kids' hour. This was your domain. Forget opera, forget Evelyn and Gregory. You wanted cowboys, space rangers, mad scientists with questionable ethics. And they delivered. The Lone Ranger, with his silver bullets and dramatic galloping. Captain Midnight, with his coded messages and secret decoder rings. And your favorite, Little Orphan Annie, because you never knew if Daddy Warbucks would come through this time. They were fast, they were wild, and they always ended on a cliffhanger. One episode left your mouth hanging open when the villain turned out to be Annie's piano teacher. You stared at your own piano for a week like it might attack. Historians still argue whether these shows helped instill moral values or just sold sugary cereal. Probably both. You learned to say, "Gosh golly," instead of cursing, and also became weirdly obsessed with Ovaltine. Sometimes the shows asked kids to write letters to say where they listened from. You sent one once, carefully printed in your best handwriting. "Dear Radio Rangers, I'm from Nebraska and I have a dog named Pluto. Can I join your club?" You never got a reply. Still, you listened every afternoon, sitting as close to the speaker as you dared, hands tucked under your legs, heart racing with each crackle of static and trumpet fanfare. You didn't just hear stories, you lived them. On a space cruiser, in a haunted mansion, galloping across the dusty plains. And when the announcer finally said, "Tune in tomorrow, same time, same channel," you always did, because for those few magic minutes, your world expanded far beyond the front porch. By the time your dad came home from work, the house was already simmering with leftover voices from the radio. He'd walk in, hang his cap on the hook by the door, and grunt something like, "Did that nosy lady finally get her comeuppance?" Referring to Mrs. Bramble from Ma Perkins. He'd pretend not to care, but he always seemed to know exactly what was going on. Funny that evenings were a different kind of radio hour, no more weeping heiresses or plucky orphans. Now it was time for news, jazz, and your dad's favorite, the comedy shows. You'd gather around, tired but content, bellies full of cabbage and boiled potatoes. The lights dimmed, and the radio glowed like a tiny sun. Then came the unmistakable voice of Jack Benny. It was warm and dry, with a pause that could last forever. You learned more about timing from Jack Benny's silence than from any of his actual jokes. That man could stretch a single word into an entire routine. When he shouted, "Now cut that out," the whole living room wheezed. Even Grandma smiled, just barely. Historians still argue whether Jack Benny was the king of deadpan or merely the luckiest man in broadcasting. Either way, his show ran for decades, and not just because of the jokes. It was his little world. The stingy violin player, the loyal valet Rochester, the perpetually broken-down Maxwell Carr. Week after week, listeners returned not just for the punchlines but for the familiarity. Like checking in with cousins who always had something ridiculous going on. Radio comedy had a different flavor than today's stand-up. It was cleaner but not dull, sharp but not mean, and always with that wink of absurdity. Fibber McGee's Closet, for example, an endless, chaotic avalanche of junk that collapsed every time someone opened the door. You'd hear pots, pans, and inexplicably, a tuba crash to the floor. Every single time. And yet, you laughed every time. There was also Burns and Allen. George with his tired straight man routine, and Gracie, oh Gracie Allen. The woman could say something so logically backwards it made your brain tie itself in knots. I'm going to wear my spring hat to bed so I'll dream of flowers. Makes no sense. Perfect sense. These shows didn't just entertain, they built entire realities. You imagined their homes, their kitchens, their faces, even though you'd never seen them. Sometimes, when pictures did show up in magazines, you felt betrayed. Wait, that's what George Burns looks like. You pictured someone taller. You remember one evening, your uncle declared radio comedy the only medicine cheaper than aspirin. He said it with a chuckle, but there was truth under the laugh. Money was tight, hope was thinner, but for 30 golden minutes you could forget your worn-out shoes and laugh until your ribs hurt. And then came the crooners. As if the comedians were your dessert, the ballads that followed were the warm drink before bed. Bing Crosby would slide onto the airwaves like honey drizzling onto hot biscuits. That voice, liquid velvet, touched with a wink. He'd sing Pennies from Heaven, and you'd almost believe they were real. You'd catch yourself looking up, just in case. Your mom had a thing for Bing. She'd fan herself with the dish towel and mutter, "That man could sing me into next Thursday." You had no idea what that meant, but it sounded dangerous. Other nights, it was Rudy Vallee or Kate Smith, or the Ink Spots harmonizing like angels who'd once gotten into a bar fight. Music filled the gaps that comedy couldn't. The cracks in the walls, the silence after someone whispered about a job loss, or war, or that weird cough grandpa wouldn't shake. Music floated over all of it, forgave it, gave it rhythm, and just as your eyelids started to droop, the national anthem would play. Every night, no one told you to stand, but you always did. Even barefoot, in pajamas, your hair still smelling of soap, you stood up straight like you were being watched by history itself. And then the radio went quiet. Not off, just quiet, like it was sleeping too. That moment, the one right after the anthem and before the click of the dial, was sacred. The room would hold its breath. Not from reverence, exactly, but from some collective recognition that the world had, for a little while, made sense. Then came the click, and the soft shuffle of feet headed toward bed. Maybe someone hummed a leftover melody. Maybe someone whispered, "I hope Evelyn's twin gets what's coming." You crawled under thin sheets and stared at the ceiling. The dark wasn't scary, not with all those voices still echoing softly in your head. You imagined what tomorrow's episodes might bring. A new mystery, another misunderstanding, someone getting married or buried. Soap operas liked both equally. And always, you pictured the faces behind those voices. You gave them expressions, gestures, maybe even gave them names. They were yours now. That's what radio did. It didn't just tell stories. It let you build them. Historians still argue whether this golden age of radio was truly golden, or just a relic of necessity. A brief, shining era born of economic hardship and limited alternatives. But for you, it was everything. It was your window, your playground, your lullaby. And somewhere, in that odd little mental archive of old jokes and fading jingles, a part of it still plays on loop. The static, the soft guitar, the voice that promised, "Stay tuned. We'll be right back." Only now, no one ever really leaves. The next morning always came too soon. You'd stretch under your scratchy blanket, blink at the dusty sunlight filtering through threadbare curtains, and already miss the voices from last night. The ones that made your world bigger than the front porch and the schoolyard. But by mid-afternoon, the radio was back on again. It was never really gone for long. The airwaves became your babysitter, your tutor, your nosy aunt who gossiped from 3 states away. And now it was Saturday. That meant 2 things, chores and the shadow. The chores you could grumble through. Scrubbing the floor, hanging laundry, picking through potatoes so the sprouting ones didn't sneak into dinner. But the shadow? That was serious business. It didn't matter how many socks needed darning. Nothing interrupted the shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? That voice, smooth, eerie, low. The shadow knows. The laughter that followed was like a knife dipped in chocolate, delicious but sharp. And you? You sat cross-legged, goosebumps pricking your arms even in July. Historians still argue whether the shadow was the true origin of American superheroes. Some say Superman and Batman owe more to this invisible vigilante than any comic strip ever drawn. Others argue it was just a glorified detective story with a spooky laugh. But you didn't care about the debate. You were too busy scanning the room, wondering if Lamont Cranston might be hiding in your cupboard. These thrillers weren't just fun. They were practice. You learned to listen for clues, to predict the twist, to ask the right questions. And you did it all in your head, with no visuals, no graphics, just pure imagination. Try that on a tablet. There were dozens of shows like it. Lights Out, Inner Sanctum, Suspense. They played with your nerves the way a cat plays with string. Footsteps echoing in an empty house. A clock ticking louder than it should. A scream always just 1 second too late to save anyone. Your grandma hated them. "Don't put on that nonsense," she'd mutter. No good ever came from a man talkin' in the dark. But your dad? He'd sneak into the living room and stand behind you, arms crossed, listening just as intently. Never admitted it, of course. Said he was checking the radiator. And then there were the westerns. If mystery shows were the ghost stories of the airwaves, the cowboy serials were your epic bedtime tales. The Lone Ranger galloped across the plains on a signal of trumpets and hoofbeats. "Hi-yo, Silver, away!" echoed off living room walls like a war cry. You didn't just listen. You became the masked man, wind in your hair, justice in your hands. "Tonto, we ride." You rode with them. Gunsmoke, Red Rider, Hopalong Cassidy. Each episode was a dust-streaked, six-shooter morality play. Bad guys wore black hats. Good guys had a drawl and a horse that understood English. And always, the innocent got saved just in time. You knew how it would end. That was the point. Historians still argue whether these westerns helped cement America's myth of frontier heroism, or if they just smoothed over a much rougher truth. But in your living room, on a floor pillow that was losing its stuffing, they were a lifeline. The world might be hard, but justice still rode into town on a white horse. There was something in the rhythm of those stories. Good guy rides into chaos. Chaos resists. Good guy wins. Town claps. Ride into sunset. Repeat. In a world still bruised by war and economic despair, those rhythms were more than entertainment. They were promises. And in between the thrills, you had commercials. Ah, the commercials. No one remembers the jokes from Lum and Abner, but you definitely remember Pepsodent toothpaste jingles. You'll wonder where the yellow went, still stuck in your head, decades later, like some ghost of minty freshness. Or Ovaltine. Oh, how Ovaltine owned the radio. They practically held your decoder ring hostage until you sent away 3 box tops and waited 6 to 8 weeks for delivery. You remember the waiting more than the ring itself. Radio made advertising personal. It wasn't just a slogan, it was part of the show. The announcer's voice didn't change when he shifted from solving a murder to selling you foot powder. You trusted him, maybe too much. And then, once a year, something magical happened. The president spoke. You didn't always understand what he said. There were lots of grown-up words like tariffs and foreign aid and appropriations. But his voice came through the speaker like thunderclouds wrapped in velvet. Confident, calm, deliberate. Franklin D. Roosevelt called them his fireside chats. And somehow, felt like he was talking directly to you, to your family, to that weirdly shaped stain on the linoleum floor. "Good evening, friends." That was the voice that told your parents it was going to be okay, that work would come back, that the bank wouldn't eat the house. You didn't need to know what the New Deal meant. You just needed to hear that voice. Historians still argue whether the fireside chats were true transparency or political theater, but they changed how America communicated forever. Radio became not just an escape, but a forum. Connection, comfort, and when Roosevelt passed, you remember the silence that followed. It wasn't just the loss of a leader. It was the loss of a voice that had filled your home for over a decade, a steady drumbeat of assurance. Gone. That's when you realized the radio wasn't just noise. It was company. Even when your brothers moved out, Even when your school closed during that one especially bad winter. Even when Grandma passed and her rocker stopped creaking in the corner. The voices on the radio never left. They stayed, like friends too stubborn to leave the party. Even now, if you close your eyes just right, you can still hear that faint hum, that flicker of static, that warm, knowing voice saying, "And now, a word from our sponsors." And somehow, the world feels just a bit safer. Later, you'd learn the technical names, superheterodyne circuits, vacuum tubes, amplitude modulation. But back then, radio was just magic in a box. Every home had its own sacred setup. In your case, it sat like a crown jewel on a crocheted doily in the living room, next to the family Bible and a pot of geraniums your aunt insisted were miracle flowers. You weren't allowed to put your feet on the table, but you could lean your elbows on it if a cereal got especially intense. And you did often. The box itself was hefty, warm to the touch, like it had a heartbeat, walnut wood, smooth dials, and a golden mesh speaker that crackled just a little before the sound came through, like it was clearing its throat politely. The dial was a rainbow of cities: Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, San Francisco. Turning it felt like spinning a globe with your fingertips. And the sound, oh, the sound. Not stereo, not clean, but alive. A little fuzzy, a little echoey, but full of personality. Sometimes you'd turn the knob just enough to catch two stations battling for control, like dueling cowboys at high noon. You learned to hold the dial at just the right angle, like balancing a spoon on your nose. Of course, not everything on the radio was thrilling or profound. There were stretches of grain reports, polka music, or the odd man reading poetry in a voice that sounded like molasses being poured too slowly. Still, there was always something on. And in the quiet corners of the day, that was a kind of comfort. One particular voice stands out: Eleanor Roosevelt. You didn't expect to like her. She wasn't flashy. She didn't have catchphrases. But when she spoke, it felt like someone was folding laundry beside you, telling the truth gently but without apology. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's radio addresses were truly influential or just the soft side of politics. But if you were a girl, especially one stuck in a small town, they were a lighthouse. Here was a woman in charge of her mind, who didn't flinch from hard topics, who made it okay to feel things out loud. And then came the soap operas. Oh, the glorious drama. You'd listen in on the tangled lives of characters you knew better than your cousins. Ma Perkins, Stella Dallas, the romance of Helen Trent. Housewives with secret pasts, doctors with tortured hearts, love triangles that bent time and space. It wasn't just the stories, it was the ritual, the daily rhythm. You'd plan your chores around when young Dr. Malone aired. You'd hush anyone who dared talk over our gal Sunday. How could this girl, born in a humble log cabin in the little mining town of Silver Creek, Colorado, find happiness as the wife of England's richest and most handsome Lord Henry Brinthrope? Well, how could she? You needed to know. And yes, these shows were full of cliches. Yes, the crying violins could be a little much. But they were also full of women, complicated, brave, vulnerable women, navigating love and loss and small, everyday victories. They made you believe your ordinary life might someday bloom into something cinematic. Your grandpa used to roll his eyes, muttering about ladies and their stories, but catch him at the right moment and he was listening too, usually while pretending to nap. And just when you thought the day couldn't hold more wonder, the sun would dip low and the big band shows would take over. Now that was music. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Count Basie, blaring through the speaker like the whole brass section had crammed into your parlor. Even if your radio was the size of a bread box, the music made your house feel like a ballroom. You'd practice your steps in the kitchen, hands outstretched, pretending you were dancing at the Waldorf. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Slide, pivot, laugh. Your sister would join in, and soon the two of you were twirling like wind-up dolls, knocking over chairs and not caring a bit. Historians still argue whether radio made jazz truly mainstream or simply repackaged it for white America. But in that moment, wrapped in rhythm and joy, the music didn't care what history thought. It moved you anyway, And then came the war. You remember the first time the news came through, too loud, too fast, too real. We interrupt this broadcast. Pearl Harbor. Everything changed. The radio wasn't just fun anymore, it was essential. A lifeline. The source of truth. Roosevelt's voice returned, older now, more weathered.
No fireside pleasantries.
Just the weight of the world, pressed through the speaker and into your bones. And yet, the programming didn't vanish. It adapted. The radio turned into a war machine, half battlefield report, half morale booster. There were new shows, new songs, new slogans. Loose lips sink ships. Buy war bonds. Even Superman fought the Nazis. And at night, when blackout curtains turned your neighborhood into a velvet cave, you'd gather around the glowing dial like pilgrims at a shrine. You'd listen to Edward R. Murrow report live from London as bombs fell in the background. You didn't know how he stayed calm. You didn't know how you did. Historians still argue whether Murrow's broadcasts turned journalism into a noble profession or just made the war feel winnable. But for you, they gave the chaos a narrator. And that was everything. The radio gave you both reality and reprieve. By day, you scrubbed ration stamps and feared telegrams. By night, you laughed with Fibber McGee or dreamed along with the Bickersons. Even through war, the golden voices stayed. They cracked jokes. They made music. They cried quietly when needed. They were family. They were yours. As the war dragged on, your radio became the hearth of your household, drawing neighbors in like moths to a soft, comforting flame. You'd hear footsteps crunch on the gravel outside, and soon enough, familiar voices filled the room. Mrs. Jenkins from down the street with her knitting, Mr. Thompson from the bakery, and the Johnson kids who were just a little too loud to be trusted near a radio. The gatherings weren't planned. They became ritual. The hum of voices, the crackle of static, the sharp intakes of breath during the news bulletins. These sounds wove a fabric of community that felt almost sacred. It was also during these years you became acquainted with the beloved GI. Joes of the airwaves, the soldiers' broadcasts. The Armed Forces radio service took over frequencies to bring music, comedy, and news to troops overseas. But you back home heard every note, every joke, every heartfelt letter read aloud with an accent that sometimes made you grin and other times tugged at your heart. These shows reminded you that even on distant battlefields, laughter and music were powerful weapons. In your own living room, you heard the original broadcasts of Command Performance, where stars like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby performed live for the troops. The clever jokes and sketches often poked gentle fun at military life, an inside joke for anyone who had a loved one away. Your heart swelled with pride, knowing that the voices on the radio were part of a larger effort, a giant invisible thread linking you to the war front. Yet not all was lighthearted. You learned quickly that even radio, with all its warmth, couldn't shield you from the harsher realities. You heard announcements about rationing updates and casualty lists. You heard speeches by President Roosevelt rallying a weary nation. The airwaves were a lifeline, but also a reminder of how fragile peace could be. Historians still argue whether radio's influence helped keep American morale intact or simply masked the brutal truths for those on the home front. But for you, in those quiet evenings surrounded by the crackling glow of the speaker, it was a balm, a steady heartbeat in uncertain times. And then, as the war finally wound down, the radio waves shifted again. The joyous announcements of victory, the soft melancholy for the fallen, and the hopeful melodies of a nation ready to rebuild. The golden radio days might have been ending, but their echo, those voices, those songs, that shared experience, would linger in your memory for years to come. With the war behind you, the post-war boom arrived, bringing with it a new kind of excitement. Radios didn't lose their charm overnight, but television's flickering promise was on the horizon. For now, though, your evenings still revolved around that familiar glowing box of sound. Variety shows, soap operas, and comedy hours filled your nights with gentle laughter and a sense of togetherness. You might have caught the first episodes of programs like The Lone Ranger or The Shadow on the radio, where masked heroes fought for justice just as your country was rebuilding itself. Golden Age of radio became a treasured memory, but it also transformed into a cultural touchstone that shaped your worldview. You could quote favorite lines from Fibber McGee and Molly, or sing along with Amos and Andy episodes that your parents listened to decades earlier. The radio had become a storyteller, a companion, and a trusted friend in your home, weaving a rich tapestry of shared experience across generations. Curiously, this era also gave birth to one of radio's quirkiest phenomena. The electronic brain shows, mystery programs with sound effects so vivid that sometimes listeners swore they could feel the creak of a door or the whisper of footsteps right in their living rooms. People debated endlessly whether some broadcasts caused real fright or whether imagination was the real culprit. Historians still argue whether these shows paved the way for today's immersive media experiences or were simply innocent fun. And let's not forget the radio quiz shows, where your knowledge, or sometimes your sheer luck, could win you a prize, adding an element of playful suspense to the quiet nights. Listening felt like being part of a game show audience without ever leaving your armchair. You might have dreamed of calling in, but the phones weren't quite ready for live audience participation just yet. As the 1940s progressed, the radio's role as a unifier continued, especially for those living in more isolated rural areas. For many, it was the only connection to the wider world, a reminder that they were part of something larger. Your radio didn't just entertain, it educated, informed, and comforted. Now, as you settle into this familiar past, you realize how this golden era shaped the American spirit in quiet, steady waves, long before the colorful screens took over your evenings. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw the beginning of a subtle shift, as television sets started to replace radios in many homes. But even as moving pictures flickered into popularity, your radio still held a special place. You remember how families gathered around the radio one last time to listen to the final episodes of classic shows like Suspense or The Shadow, savoring those stories as if saying goodbye to an old friend. The voices in your living room were changing, but the warmth remained. Interestingly, this transition period sparked a unique blend of innovation. Some radio programs adapted to TV, while others doubled down on the intimacy of audio-only storytelling, knowing they could offer a different kind of connection than the flashy new screens. You might have chuckled at radio DJs spinning records and talking casually to listeners, creating a sense of personal friendship over the airwaves. You also witnessed how radio became crucial during moments of national tension, like the early Cold War era, delivering news with a calm authority that reassured many Americans facing uncertain times. Historians still argue whether radio helped ease anxiety or whether it sometimes amplified fears with dramatic broadcasts. Whatever the truth, your radio was a steady companion through these changing seasons. Another charming tidbit is how local radio stations became centers of community life, playing hometown bands, announcing church socials, and reading out birthday wishes. Small moments that knitted neighborhoods closer together. In rural America, where TV signals struggled to reach, radio remained the evening's best entertainment and connection to the outside world. And through all this, you probably noticed that radio's golden era wasn't just about entertainment. It was a quiet revolution in how people shared stories, stayed informed, and built relationships without ever seeing each other face to face. That legacy still hums softly in the background of our digital age. As the 1950s rolled in, the radio's role continued to evolve, but its heartbeat never quite faded away. While television dazzled with images, your radio still offered a gentle refuge, a place where your imagination could roam free without the need for screens. You might have found yourself drifting off to sleep with the soft sounds of late-night jazz programs or soothing storytelling shows, the voices weaving a comforting cocoon around you. One of the quieter revolutions of this era was the rise of the DJ personality, those familiar voices who felt like old friends, spinning records and chatting casually as if you were right there in the room. They shaped musical tastes and local culture in ways that still resonate today. There's something quietly magical about a voice coming through the static that makes even the most ordinary evenings feel special. There's also a fascinating story about how some families treated their radios almost like a treasured pet, winding the dials carefully, cleaning the knobs, and placing the set in a proud spot in the living room. For many, it was the centerpiece of daily life, a symbol of connection and comfort in a rapidly changing world. Historians still debate whether the intimacy of radio could ever be matched by television or digital media, and you can see why as you settle in with these stories. And as you ease toward the end of this journey through America's golden radio days, you might smile at the thought of how something so simple shaped so many lives. Quietly, gently, with voices that soothed, entertained, and connected millions. The radio was a friend in the dark, a storyteller in the silence, and for many, a cherished companion on lonely nights. So now, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world of voices fades softly into the night, remember this golden age not just as a history lesson, but as a warm embrace from the past, proof that sometimes the gentlest sounds can carry us furthest. And now, as we let these stories settle softly in the quiet corners of your mind, imagine the gentle crackle of an old radio tuning out, the last faint echoes of voices bidding you good night. The world slows down around you, the busy noise of the day giving way to the soothing hum of calm. Picture yourself nestled in a cozy room, perhaps by a small lamp casting a warm glow on worn pages of a well-loved book, or simply resting in the quiet embrace of your favorite chair. There's a comfort in these fading moments, a reminder that history is not just dates and events, but the stories and sounds that wrap around us like a soft blanket. The golden days of radio remind us how connection can thrive in the simplest forms, how voices, carried invisibly through the air, can calm restless hearts. So breathe deeply, feel the weight of the day lifting gently off your shoulders, and let your mind drift on these whispered tales. The world outside dims as you journey inward, toward rest, toward dreams. Sleep well, knowing the past is always here with you, humming softly, a quiet lullaby for the night.